Hey everybody, Dave here. Hope you're doing well as we near the end of the year. So in this episode, I'm going to share with you two pieces that I produced and released last year on the Deadbeat Philosophy YouTube channel, but that I haven't yet released here on the Hegel-Haus YouTube channel or on this podcast feed. So the first compares Plato and Kant, the second Aristotle and Nietzsche. I hope that you enjoy, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.
What's up, everybody? Dave here, and today we got a philosophical smackdown between Plato and Kant. Who's the better philosopher? Whose works were more important? Who should you read first if you've never read either of them? I'm going to give you my take today on Deadbeat Philosophy. Plato and Kant, both incredibly influential, important figures in their own right. Most people who study philosophy encounter them in some ways. They both wrote on a number of different subjects. They actually have a lot in common, but let's first start with the contrast. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher, born and died in Athens, although he traveled around the Mediterranean during his life. He lived between the 5th and the 4th century BCE. He founded the academy, sort of started the whole academic trend and trajectory in global or at least Western culture. Plato was the mentor of Aristotle, and Plato himself had been mentored by Socrates in a certain sense. They stand in that lineage with one another. Plato wrote a lot of texts, mostly dialogues. That's texts between different interlocutors, speakers who talk to one another and engage in intense philosophical discussion. Today we have most of Plato's texts, which is pretty remarkable for an ancient author. Also important about Plato is Plato's relationship with Socrates. So I mentioned Socrates was Plato's mentor. Socrates is also Plato's main character. In most of Plato's texts and most of Plato's dialogues, including the Phaedo and the Republic that I have here, Socrates is present in the center of the conversations, asking questions, responding to questions, having dialogue, meeting different figures in different contexts. So it's very interesting when you think about Plato and Socrates, they're actually very closely together. Kant lived in the 18th century in what was then Prussia and is now actually Russia. His city was called Königsberg, now it's Kaliningrad. He wrote in Latin and then in German and innovated philosophy in the German language in a very important way. Wrote on both theoretical topics, like about the nature of the world and how humans understand things. His most famous work from that branch is The Critique of Pure Reason. But also, Kant was incredibly influential, maybe even more influential if you want to just think in the broadest sense, in the realm of ethics and politics and practical philosophy. So Kant's best known work in that regard is the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But Kant, also an Enlightenment dude. He innovated the whole concept of enlightenment. He had an influential essay, What is Enlightenment?, that defined enlightenment as thinking for yourself, emerging out of your state of self-incurred immaturity into a sort of adulthood, as it were. Kant celebrated reason. Reason was at the center of Kant's mature philosophy. Kant was active for over 50 years, was thinking things, constantly changing his mind. He never had a family. We don't know if he had any romantic relationships. He did have close friendships, but he devoted himself to philosophy and to his studies and to writing and lecturing. He was a very influential lecturer, kind of like Plato. That's maybe a similarity. They both had many students. They were both popular amongst their students, and they both innovated different methods of teaching. So in addition to epistemology and theoretical philosophy and ethics and practical philosophy, Kant also made enormous contributions to anthropology and theories of human nature and philosophy of religion and aesthetics, philosophical logic, philosophy of language in its early form. Basically, any sub-area within philosophy after Kant was shaped by Kant in some way. All right, here's the smackdown part. Plato versus Kant. These are probably their most influential, biggest books. Plato's Republic, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, both classic canonical texts, both, in a certain sense, hard to critique just insofar as they're seen as these shining examples of philosophy in the Western mode. But which one's better? Well, the Republic has to do with politics, has to do with the city, the state, the citizen. It also has to do with knowledge and a lot of other human activities within that. But if you're especially interested in political matters and in questions of individual identity and the place of the individual in society, Plato's Republic is the one for you. And also, like whether the art should be in the city. There's some wild ideas in here. I'm just going to give you two. One, Plato excludes poetry from the city, so he thinks the best kind of cities don't have poetry. That's interesting for us to consider. You think of Sappho over on her island doing her poetry there, kind of in exile. But also, Plato in this text endorses this idea of collective child rearing. So basically, the idea is that the ideal city-state for Plato would be one where all parents give up their children at birth, and those children are raised by the group, not by individual parents. And there's a sort of collective identity and ownership and stewardship of the educational process. And that's a really radical idea, and I think I've always liked thinking about that since I, first heard about that. It's pretty wild. Whether that would be good or not, is that a utopia or a dystopia for you? Good question. On the other hand, we have Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So this is like one of the shining works of modern theoretical philosophy, epistemology. Kant here introduces what's known as his critical philosophy, makes this critical turn, introduces a new notion of reason and human understanding and a new sort of picture of what cognition is, if you want to put it that way, and focusing on the relationship of the human's faculties to the natural world and to sensory input, and breaking down the relationship between different faculties and making an argument that it is possible to, through our faculties, have genuine scientific knowledge of outside objects, or to have, in more technical Kantian terms, to have synthetic a priori judgments. We can make those about objects. I think that's how it goes. But there's a bunch of stuff in here, just this whole new vision of the human, not just the human, but the rational mind, really presaged not just, like modern philosophical approaches to thinking, logic, cognition, and conceptuality, but early psychology, approaches to cognition in a systematic sort of way. Many people say that after this text, there's a sort of Kantian turn in all of Western philosophy, at least in the areas of Kant's influence, that Kant put this certain answer or perspective or proposal on the table, and that after Kant, you couldn't but respond to it. You had to form a response. Whether that's true or not, is that overinflating Kant's influence? It depends on how you read the unfolding of the history of philosophy. But it's important also to note that Kant himself would stay true to the ideas in this book over the coming 2 decades of his life. So he was already quite old when this book appeared. So he was born in 1724. This came out in 81. So what does that make him? Almost 60. Kant was kind of, some people say he was a late bloomer, but that just means that he became very popular later in his life. And this book is really what catapulted him back onto the scene. He was already known before that. He had published a number of books on aesthetics, on the cosmos. He was known for his rhetoric. He had already introduced anthropology as a discipline prior to this, but when this came out, it really put Kant on the international radar. And after this text, Kant became like a celebrity in European intellectual life. He became, at the peak of his career, this is an interesting fact, the most highly paid professor in all of Prussia. So he had a direct and somewhat fractious but still close relationship with both the kings. I think it was Frederick the Great, and then Frederick's son, who's also called Frederick, who took over during Kant's lifetime as well. But even though Kant was at one point censored for his radical views, what we're seeing is, or let's say unorthodox views on religion and the relationship between religion and reason, Kant's view, in brackets here, is that religion should always answer to reason, and that reason is sort of where the buck stops. So you could see or imagine the sense in which that's a bit controversial. And he even defines in that phase of his work God as an idea of reason. So Kant's a real interesting figure. And in this text, this is the one that I read as an undergrad. Now people often read other ones, but I love the cover of it. He really digs into detail about all that. And the idea of, the synthetic a priori, of the antinomies, of there's just a bunch of concepts and framings and sort of set pieces that are in this book that are very interesting. It's a difficult read. Plato's Republic is definitely the better read if you're interested just in some bedtime reading, or you actually want to, let's say, get some joy out of reading, or read it with a group of other people. Probably the Republic's the way to go. But this text also worth grinding your teeth into, worth thinking about, and worth having on your bookshelf. Smackdown, which text better? I'm going to go with the Republic. So you can't outshine the Republic. Better readability, and the range of theories and ideas that are covered here in political philosophy, but also theories of knowledge and identity, human nature, and there's a bunch of stuff that I didn't even address. It's just a very sweeping, scoping work. So, sorry, Critique of Pure Reason, Republic wins. Smackdown number 2. We got here Plato's Phaedo and Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. This translation said, sometimes it's translated Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. So let's take a look at these two texts. Which one would win? Which one is better? So first, Plato's Phaedo. This is like my favorite Plato text because it's very dramatic. This is where Socrates dies. I mean, can it get more dramatic than that? There's not a Plato text where Socrates is born. I told you before how Socrates is like Plato's main character. In most of Plato's dialogue, Socrates features in a speaking role that's predominant, and also often an argumentative or logical role that's dominant. So Socrates sort of is the eyes or the philosophical mind through which Plato explores these philosophical issues. That's important to think because Plato's earlier works are often seen to be more reflective of the historical Socrates. So if you want to understand what Socrates was about or thought and not what Plato himself came to think, because there is a difference, then look at Plato's earlier works, the Apology, the Euthyphro, and others. But if you want to see what Plato's own thinking was about, that is to say, how Plato developed ideas that went above and beyond, or at least extended out apart from the ideas that his mentor Socrates had, then look at Plato's middle or late works. And the Phaedo, like the Republic, which we talked about before, is one of these texts where we see that middle period Plato exploring his own ideas. But it's also very dramatic with Socrates dying, Socrates given poison by the city of Athens. So the story, which if you have followed Socrates, it's maybe worth looking into. It's just a real interesting story. So Socrates was kind of like a gadfly. He was, by this point, well known. Imagine him in old age. He already had a big reputation as kind of an asshole, but also like a smart asshole that people like being around. He was a stone cutter, and he had a family. His partner, his wife, Xanthippe, and he had several children. But apparently he wasn't as close to them as he was to his male friends, and he mostly hung out with other males and talked with other males. That's an important thing to note with regards to these Platonic dialogues, although not exclusively. He was controversial, and he, in the city of Athens, came to be seen as a threat to public morality, and there was a sort of moral panic around Socrates, in particular his relationship to the children and to young people, and what sort of ideas Socrates might be planting into these young people's heads about society and about the gods in particular, and about, so he was accused of a sort of blasphemy, corrupting of the children, which carried with it a sentence of death. But Socrates had powerful friends, and it's clear from the context that he could have escaped. And in the dialogue, the Credo, I believe it's the Credo, yes, we see Socrates in prison offer the opportunity to escape, but turning the opportunity down on grounds of principle. So that comes to a head in the Phaedo, where Socrates actually dies. He stays in prison. He accepts his punishment, and he, at the end, drinks the hemlock poison, which has been prepared for him, and he dies. And that's how it goes. So this is an incredible text just on dramatic lines. And if you know the broader story, it's like it's like the Return of the Jedi of Plato, or of Socrates' lifespan. So It's also a text about death and dying. It's a text about the soul and the fear we have about death and our ideas of ourselves, both material and immaterial, and the question of what of ourselves, if anything, lives on past death, and really directly focuses on that fear of death. And in particular, Socrates' his friends who are there in the cell with him as he's drinking the poison, as he's talking about why he's going to drink the poison, as he's settling his, kind of accounts and saying his goodbyes, as it were. It's all those friends who are around him. They're very afraid. So Socrates himself is not afraid, consistent with his own philosophy, but they're all afraid. They're afraid for him and they're afraid for themselves. So Socrates in this text then spends his final hours talking about all this with his friends, proposing different ideas, different hypotheses, and moving on. It's really interesting in that regard as well. And I think that if, like me, you're interested in questions about death and mortality and finitude and these sort of things, it's a wonderful text. All right, next we got Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. Here, translated Groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals. There's different ones. This was the first one I read, an older translation. I really like the cover as well, so I'm going to refer to this one. Kant wrote this in, 1785, published it in 1786, and this, like the Critique of Pure Reason that we talked about before, was Kant's first major entry point into ethics and moral philosophy. So he would go on to write multiple other texts in ethics, such as the Critique of Practical Reason, his second critique, and the Metaphysics of Morals, his final major moral philosophical work. But it was this book, which is much shorter than the other ones, much more compact, that had a direct influence in Kant's time, and then since has become incredibly influential and often assigned and often read. So maybe in college courses, it's very common for this to be read in a number of different contexts. The text is important because it's very theoretical, it's abstract, it's working at a level of laying a certain foundation for how we can even think about morals. So Kant's interested in morals and ethics and human action and the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do, and how we know what the right thing is and what the wrong thing is, and how can we trust our judgments about that, and how should we act in relationship to that. All of that's addressed in this text, and Kant makes some very influential arguments here. So just to point out a couple of these arguments, one involves the categorical imperative. So you may have heard about this. It's formulated in different ways here, but Kant's categorical imperative is basically every rational being must act as if its actions would be binding for all rational beings. And this is also stated something like, always treat the humanity in yourself never as a means, but always as an ends. I'll have to kind of correct myself with regards to that. But it's formed in a number of different ways. Some people compare it to the golden rule, basically this idea that you should act such that if your acts were generalized so that everybody did them, then you'd be okay with that. So do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It's a sort of picture of moral reciprocity, and of when you're acting, you're not just acting alone, you're acting in concert with others in a fundamental way. And what it means to act morally for Kant is acting rationally. It's using your reason, and your reason is what binds you to other rational beings, including humans. But I always like pointing this out. Also, Kant was open to extraterrestrials who may be rational. So early in his career, he had an explicit theory that different planets in our solar system may, or likely did, he thought, have intelligent life. And intelligent life in the sense of having reason and ostensibly being ethical agents who we have duties towards. So Kant does restrict rational moral agency to human beings on the planet Earth. And so non-human animals, plants, artworks, robots, everything that's not a human being on the planet Earth is excluded from direct moral consideration in Kant. In some of my other work, I've addressed this, and I find that cut also very interesting and problematic. But in this text, Kant offers his best defense, his most influential defense of this fundamental idea around reason, moral action, and around also the goodwill, having a goodwill, the goodwill acting on intentions. That's the other idea. That being the only unconditionally good thing in the world. So thinking of this sort, this text has been very influential. It's also intellectually at the roots of modern human rights theory and let's say the UN Convention on Universal Human Rights, the idea that all humans have dignity, all rational beings, including human beings, must always be treated with respect, and their humanity ought to be respected. And we ought not to think of them just as means to accomplishing ends or to use them or instrumentalize them, but also always have them in mind and regard them as ends in themselves, that's worthy in their own right. So that idea, if you just kind of chew on that, you can sense how influential that was and remains. All right, smackdown time. Plato's Phaedo or Kant's Groundwork. Which of these is the better philosophical text? Boom. I'm going to say Kant this time. So I love this text. This is like a very personal text. It's a great read, great story, highly recommendable. But just in terms of influence in our world and maybe importance, whether you agree with Kant's ideas or not, just the idea of full moral status for rational beings and of dignity and the defense of human personhood that's offered here seems more relevant than ever, even if these concepts are very fraught today and under threat today, and it's unclear how the future is going to play out with them. So I think this is the text that would win out, and that's what I got to say. So what's the result of our analysis? Boom, 2 texts. Maybe I'd say if you're going to check out Plato and Kant, do the Republic and the Groundwork, start with these, then build on out. Thanks, everybody. This has been a Philosophical Smackdown. We'll see you next time. Bye. Aristotle or Nietzsche? Who's the greater philosopher? Who should you read first? Who had the greater impact on humanity? Which is the one whose book you should purchase for your mother for Mother's Day? So we're going to compare 2 works from Aristotle to 2 works from Nietzsche. We have from Aristotle the Politics and the Poetics, and from Nietzsche the Genealogy of Morals and Thus Spake Zarathustra. Let's start with Aristotle. Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher, if not the most important, influential ancient Greek philosopher, then the second or third. Aristotle was a student of Plato's, and Plato in turn was a student of Socrates's. You can think about them in that threefold order. Aristotle then mentored Alexander the Great, famously. Aristotle made important and lasting contributions, not just in what we think of as philosophy, a discipline that he did more than anybody else to systematize and to establish the different positions within and the different categories of, but as a natural philosopher. Aristotle wrote about physics, he wrote about biology. Aristotle was an incredible teacher as well and had his own school that he founded that was a sort of follower of Plato's Academy, but in a different Aristotelian way. Aristotle's most important and lasting contributions are felt across really every philosophical subdiscipline, but especially metaphysics, where there's the idea of the unmoved mover and his famous account of and definition of causality. We also have the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle's notion of habit, character, the golden mean, or finding the center is articulated. You have Aristotle's Politics, which we're going to talk about, and then Aristotle's Poetics. Another general interesting fact about Aristotle is that we only have roughly a third of his written corpus that has survived from antiquity. We know that Aristotle also wrote dialogues like Plato did, and that in Aristotle's own time, he was known as a witty writer, and that was especially evident in his dialogues. But we have nothing from those dialogues. What we do have from Aristotle, though, are his technical texts that scholars think are like a type of textbook that Aristotle wrote to share with his students and others in his community. So Aristotle's philosophy often comes across as technical and scientific and methodological, and his writing, at least in English and in the languages I've been able to read him in, is powerful and is effective. But it is interesting when you consider him in comparison with Plato, who wrote almost entirely in dialogues and whose philosophy is really then articulated in that form, how different stylistically Aristotle is, and how that stylistic contribution is also a big part of Aristotle's importance in the history of philosophy. Now let's skip ahead and talk a little bit about Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a German philosopher who lived between 1844 and 1900. He's one of the most well-known and widely read philosophers in the world of the past several centuries, if not the most. Ethics, and the concept of God, and the concept of truth, and the concept of eternity. All of those things Nietzsche throws into question in a pretty systematic and brutal way that I think have, from Nietzsche's own time, rubbed many of, not necessarily his readers, because I think people who read Nietzsche appreciate him. You can't not appreciate him. He's such a good writer. But it's rubbed the wrong way the prevailing society in which Nietzsche's works have been received from the start and up through today. Nietzsche's a kind of dangerous philosopher insofar as his works really are about critiquing, and they're a sort of critique of modernity as he knew it, a critique of, in particular, European systems of morality and government and individualism and philosophy. So Nietzsche is very much a critical philosopher in the sense that he has a critique or a diagnosis of the past and of the systems in which we live that he bases his philosophy upon. And then having established that diagnosis, Nietzsche then goes on to lay out a prognosis, like what will happen in the future, and then to issue a treatment. So Nietzsche is a diagnostic philosopher, but also a philosopher with a lot to recommend. So now let's talk about two of these books. I got Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals and Aristotle's Poetics here. This volume also has Nietzsche's book Ecce Homo, which is his autobiography. That's a really interesting text if you like philosophical autobiography, but I'm going to focus on the Genealogy of Morals because that is Nietzsche's key work in moral and political philosophy. In Aristotle's Politics, we have Aristotle's theory of the polis as the state or the community or the city. We have where it's like cosmopolitan, when your polis is the cosmos. Politics, the whole idea of a politics and of having a political system, is etymologically rooted in this Greek notion of the polis. How can you understand Aristotle's Politics? It's basically an attempt to say what is natural in humans, and on the basis of that, to draw out and elaborate what is a natural way of living politically or living together for human beings. For Aristotle, humans are not the only political animal. There's also bees. We can think of meerkats, naked mole rats, ants. There's a lot of creatures who are also political. That is to say that we, like bees, live in community with one another. We're political in the sense that we belong in a polis with one another. And that's part of our nature, and that's part of who we are, and that's something that belongs to us. For Aristotle, the natural human political system is then a certain kind of state organized and governed in a certain kind of way. And over the course of the different books in this text, Aristotle lays that out and explores what that might look like in terms of literally how cities and communities are constructed, how rulers and subjects are treated with regards to one another, what sort of rules and laws and conditions for activity ought to be established in different cities. A quick way to compare Aristotle and Nietzsche on the question of politics is that you see in Aristotle a view of the natural and of human cities and communities fitting within nature and going with the grain of nature. You see something very similar in Nietzsche. In this text, the Genealogy of Morals from, 1887, here he innovates this concept of genealogy applied to morality. And the very idea that morals or morality has a genealogy at all is part of the novelty of Nietzsche's thought and what he does, and not just in this text, but in a number of his works when he focuses his thought on the history of ethics, politics. So here Nietzsche employs and develops, as he's writing, his genealogical method, which is to say that he takes a moral concept, say like goodwill or conscience or guilt or asceticism or any number of other concepts that are at play in our moral lives. The idea is that all of that has a history. It has a background. It has a past whereby things were different than where they are now. And genealogies, just like when you trace a family tree through history, genealogies are not a matter of straight linear growth, but they're a matter of a sort of chaotic, multi-directional branching. And so the whole notion of genealogy as applied to morality for Nietzsche is a way of thinking about morality in historical terms. It's important to realize and consider Nietzsche as a post-Darwinian thinker. Nietzsche anticipates Freud in many ways with his naturalized psychology of human beings. Nietzsche sees humans as sorts of animals, like Aristotle, but whereas for Aristotle, humans fit in nature in a static way, for Nietzsche, humans fit in nature in a more dynamic, energetic way. And that's because nature itself is more dynamic and energetic and unpredictable and labyrinthine and shrouded and mysterious for Nietzsche than it is for Aristotle. Here's another difference between the two of them. For Aristotle's project, his naturalized politics, is conservative in the sense that Aristotle wants to defend traditional, in his time, human institutions on the basis of their alleged naturalness, like slavery or the hierarchical relationship between the genders. For Aristotle, men stand in relationship to women in a certain way, like farmers stand to their cattle or their oxen. For Nietzsche, his philosophy, like we said before, is inherently critical insofar as he has his sights set on modern society, modern morality, modern thinking, modern philosophy, and he takes that to be deficient. And he takes his goal to be to show what's flawed and wrong and unnatural about modernity and our modern ways of living. And then again, after he's established that diagnosis, in this case, via a genealogy of morality, which will show you by tracing out the contingency and historically unpredictable unfolding of morality through history, Nietzsche believes that that will demonstrate to you that morality is not fixed, that it's not hard, that it's porous, that it has cracks in it, that morality is nothing necessary, and that it's also an elaborate human construct that emerged over the course of history for contingent historical and individual psychological reasons. Nietzsche's recommendation is that we embrace ourselves and our own ability to create new values that better fit who we are and to live our individual lives and not to be repressed. His recommendation is the proper, more natural form of human morality is one that isn't moral at all. And in some ways, so there's differences between these texts, but there's also similarities in terms of their grounding the role that nature plays in both Aristotle and Nietzsche's views of morality and politics. So which text is better? This is a really hard call to make. The more important historical text would certainly be Aristotle. It's hard for any later philosopher to match Aristotle in terms of historical importance. But if I had to choose one text to read, or one text to recommend that you read, I think you should read Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, because it's a text where you really learn about yourself and the world that you live in. And even though Nietzsche wrote it in the 1880s and had a whole host of examples in mind that now are antiquated and seem quite distant, it's clear when you stop and think about it that what Nietzsche's talking about is still very much alive today and very much a problem for us. And Nietzsche's text really still speaks to that in a very poignant way. Okay, so now let's talk about Aristotle's Poetics and Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. In the Poetics, Aristotle focuses on drama and gives us a theory of how the right and best kind of dramas unfold. He talks about tragedy and comedy and history and different genres that were already established in his time in the century before, in the so-called high era of classical Greek drama, where we have dramatists such as Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, and others performing such well-known works as Oedipus Rex, Antigone, The Frogs, The Clouds, all these well-known pieces that give rise to a number of memes throughout cultural and mythological and literary and dramatological history. Probably the best known concept in here is Aristotle's concept of catharsis. You've probably used this word catharsis. You may have found it a particular experience to be cathartic. People talk about going into the sauna or into the hot tub and having that be cathartic. People talk about going through an intense experience and then really getting something out of their system and having that processing, that sort of digestion. That's catharsis. So catharsis in Aristotle's sense is what happens in a good dramatic work where the tension is finally released near the end. Aristotle lays out a certain dramatic structure whereby things are introduced and established, and then tension builds, and then tension is released. And there's a meaning and a reflection that happens on behalf of the audience in a moment of catharsis. And catharsis is essential because without it, a dramatic work has no real emotional human value. It might be an interesting story, but for there to be real power, there has to be catharsis, and the audience has to be swept up in the power of the drama or the poetic work. So poesis has to do with creating and with imagining and positing and putting out there. So poesis, poetics, dramatic works, the creation of a work that produces emotional connection, satisfaction, release, and catharsis. In Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, this is basically, I'm sorry that the cover of this is so shiny. I have a copy here with that it was protected. Somebody gave it to me that way. So that way the jacket will survive the ages. This you can think of as Nietzsche's philosophical novel. If Ecce Homo was his autobiography, this is his philosophical novel in a sense. And Zarathustra is a character that Nietzsche innovates here, based loosely on the historical figure of Zarathustra, Zoroaster, right, from the religion Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian religion. But Nietzsche takes this figure from history and twists it and blends and puts his own stamp on it. Zarathustra is Nietzsche's hero, anti-hero. Zarathustra is a prophet, hermit guy who has spent most of his life in seclusion, living in caves, far away from other human beings, up in a mountain in his cave, but then at some point is compelled to go down to join the rest of humanity in order to complete his mission, which is a sort of educational mission, but also a sort of critique of the status quo as Zarathustra finds it. And it's also written in a more experimental verse form than Nietzsche's other texts are written. Nietzsche was a wonderful writer, as I mentioned before, and you can tell by the style of different works which work you're in. Nietzsche also famously wrote in aphorisms. That's the case of the Genealogy of Morals as well. He did have some longer form essays, but by and large, the style that characterizes his works, especially his best known and most influential works, is aphoristic. It's many smaller sections placed together. Sometimes the aphoristic section will just be a few sentences long. Sometimes it'll be several pages long, but a sequence of thematically linked and not necessarily successive aphorisms that build up a picture or an argument. And in Thus Spake Zarathustra, the aphoristic style is used to tell the story of Zarathustra's development and his interaction with figures and characters along the way. Zarathustra also uses many images and introduces a lot of different metaphors and parables, and tries to convey certain philosophical lessons to his disciples. Like the figure of Socrates, Zarathustra doesn't want disciples and wants people to think for themselves. Zarathustra is sort of an anti-guru. It's a wonderful text if you're interested in a more literary telling. It is also incredibly allegorical throughout, and the story has a lot of humor. This text was written before of the Genealogy of Morals, but it's connected to that text in Nietzsche's thinking in terms of Nietzsche's wish to present a unified theory and account of human action in the world, and to explore various archetypes and figurines of the right type of natural human who, in Zarathustra's case, is a natural being living in nature, in accordance with nature, embracing nature, but is also somebody who takes their nature into their own hands. Which of these texts would I go with if I had to go with one? I would say, in this case, I'm going to side with the Poetics. Thus Spake Zarathustra is a wonderful book. It's one that deserves multiple readings at different stages of one's life, but it didn't really establish the foundations of a whole genre or sub-discipline in the same way that the Poetics did. The Poetics is not one of Aristotle's best known works. Many folks within philosophy don't read it, or if they're going to read a text from Aristotle, they'll start with the Nicomachean Ethics, maybe the Politics, the Metaphysics, other texts other than the Poetics. But if you're interested in human emotions, certainly in drama, but also the sense of how human beings follow narrative structures and the different parts of emotional rise and fall, there's a lot of very interesting dramatic psychology, philosophy, and theorizing on nature and art and the connection between human nature and artistic processes like catharsis. So I would say go with the Poetics if you're going to go with one of these, but maybe when you're ready for it, also go for Zarathustra. All right, folks, so I hope you liked this little look at Aristotle and Nietzsche and two of their key works. I know that we barely scratched the surface on these texts and on these authors overall, so if you'd like to hear more about these figures on this channel, please let me know in the comments what you want to hear more about either Aristotle, Nietzsche, or any other figure, theme, or topic in the history of philosophy. All right, everybody, have a great day. Thanks for being here. Be authentic. Go seek some catharsis, and farewell. Bye.
The Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast is a co-production of Deadbeat Media and the Museum Hegel-Haus, Stuttgart. For more Deadbeat content and to chip in to keep the channel going, check us out at deadbeatphilosophy.substack.com. For more about the Museum Hegel-Haus, check out hegelhaus.de. That's HEGEL-HAUS.de. Adios and auf Wiedersehen.